She agreed to a 4-month vow with a younger billionaire, but he ended up adoring her for life. What would you do if someone offered you $2 million to pretend to be married for 4 months? Nina Williams never thought she'd have to answer that question. But standing in front of her foreclosed apartment with 48 hours left and $58 in her account, the 46-year-old widow was about to say yes to the most insane proposal of her life and accidentally fall in love with a billionaire 15 years younger. Family, welcome back to Mr. Sterling's Secrets of Love, where we bring you heartfelt stories that remind us love doesn't check calendars, bank accounts, or age gaps. Love finds us in the quiet, in the pain, in the pieces we leave behind. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next. And if you're returning, thank you. We appreciate you deeply. Now stay with us to the end of Nina and Germano's story. Leave a comment, like the video, and let's continue. The afternoon light slanted through Nina's small apartment windows, illuminating the stack of unpaid bills scattered across her kitchen table. 32 applications in 2 months, not one callback. Apparently, former nonprofit directors with 15 years of experience were either too experienced, too old, or too expensive for the positions she could actually get. Her phone buzzed on the counter. Sherry again. Nina, I know you're ignoring me, her best friend's voicemail began. Please let me help. I can cover this month's rent. You can pay me back whenever. Nina deleted Sherry's voicemail without listening to the rest. She couldn't bear the kindness, the pity wrapped in concern. Pride had become the last thing she owned that couldn't be foreclosed on. The next morning, she stood outside Café M on Bay Street, staring at the elegant Parisian-style windows and the well-dressed patrons sipping cappuccinos beneath striped awnings. This wasn't her world anymore. Maybe it never had been. Her jeans were clean but worn. Her blouse, once professional, now felt tired. She'd applied makeup carefully that morning, trying to hide the exhaustion carved into her face by months of sleepless nights. But standing here, watching people who didn't carry eviction notices in their purses, Nina felt like an imposter about to be exposed. She almost turned around. But then she remembered the $58 in her account. The 48 hours ticking down. The boxes stacked in her apartment, waiting for a future that didn't exist yet. Nina pushed open the door. The cafe smelled like fresh pastries and roasted coffee beans. French music played softly in the background. A young couple laughed over croissants. An older man read a newspaper, unbothered by anything as trivial as survival. Ms. Williams? Nina turned. Margaret Germano stood near a corner table, poised and polished in a way that seemed effortless. Mid-60s, silver hair styled perfectly, wearing a navy dress that probably cost more than Nina's last 3 months of rent. But her eyes weren't cold. They were sharp, assessing, but not unkind. Mrs. Germano, Nina said, her voice steadier than she felt. Margaret, please. She gestured to the table. Sit. Nina sat, feeling the expensive cushion beneath her, the polished wood under her fingertips. Margaret had already ordered 2 cappuccinos, a plate of macarons, a small quiche. Nina's stomach twisted with hunger, but she didn't reach for anything. You didn't eat breakfast, Margaret observed. It wasn't a question. Nina said nothing. Margaret slid the quiche toward her. Eat. We have a lot to discuss, and I need you clear-headed. Nina hesitated, then took a small bite. The flavors, butter, cheese, herbs, felt almost offensive after weeks of instant ramen. She forced herself to chew slowly, to not betray how desperate she actually was. Margaret sipped her cappuccino, watching Nina with the calm focus of someone used to reading people. I'm going to be direct, Margaret said finally. My son needs a wife. Nina set down her fork. You said that on the phone. And you came anyway. I'm desperate, Nina said flatly. You knew that, or you wouldn't have called me. Margaret didn't deny it. Christopher, everyone calls him Germano, is 31 years old, brilliant, successful, impossible. He inherited his grandfather's company at 25 and turned it into an empire. But his grandfather also left something else. A trust. The Germano Philanthropic Trust. Nina had heard of it. Everyone in the nonprofit world had. Billions of dollars dedicated to education, healthcare, housing. The kind of money that could change entire communities. The trust, Margaret continued, was designed to pass to Christopher on his 32nd birthday. But there's a clause. He must be married. The marriage must last a minimum of 4 months. And it must be publicly acknowledged. Nina frowned. Why would his grandfather do that? Because Christopher's grandfather believed that marriage, partnership, would ground him, make him less reckless, less isolated. Margaret's expression softened slightly. He was wrong about the method, but not about the diagnosis. My son is brilliant, but he's also alone. So marry someone, Nina said. There must be 100 women who'd... He's tried. Margaret's voice turned sharp. Twice. Both times the women turned out to be more interested in his portfolio than his person. One sold photos to a gossip magazine. The other tried to renegotiate the prenup before the wedding. She paused. Christopher doesn't trust easily, and after those experiences, he doesn't trust anyone in his social circle. Nina felt the ground shifting beneath her, the conversation turning towards something she didn't want to understand yet. Why me? She asked quietly. Margaret set down her cup. Because you're 46. Because you're not dazzled by wealth. You've lived without it long enough to know money doesn't fix everything. Because you've experienced real loss and survived it. Because you ran a nonprofit for 15 years and never once made headlines for scandal or greed. Nina's throat tightened. You researched me. Extensively. Margaret didn't apologize. I know about Michael. I know about the program losing funding. I know about the medical debt, the foreclosure, the applications you've submitted. She leaned forward slightly. I know you're drowning, Nina, and I'm offering you a lifeline. Nina wanted to be angry, wanted to feel violated by the invasion of privacy. But all she felt was exhausted. What exactly are you offering? Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a slim leather folder. She opened it, revealing a document, crisp, legal, terrifyingly official. A contract, Margaret said. You would marry Christopher, live in his home for 4 months, attend public events as his wife, maintain the appearance of a legitimate marriage. Nina stared at the pages, the words blurring together. In exchange, Margaret continued, you would receive $400,000 immediately upon signing, and $1.5 million at the end of the 4-month period, assuming the terms are fulfilled. The numbers didn't make sense. Nina had spent the last 2 years thinking in terms of hundreds. $58, $43, $12 until payday that never came. 400,000, 1.5 million. This is insane, Nina whispered. Yes. This can't be legal. It is, Margaret said calmly. Marriages of convenience are not illegal, as long as both parties consent and the terms are clear. Nina's hands shook as she picked up the contract, scanning the text. Her brain, trained by years of reviewing grant applications and legal documents, began processing the language. No physical intimacy required. Separate living quarters within the residence. Full termination clause. Either party may exit the contract with 30 days' notice, with prorated compensation. Public appearances required. Estimated 4 to 6 events per month. Non-disclosure agreement regarding the contract itself. I would have my own room? Nina asked. Your own suite. Bedroom, bathroom, sitting area. Complete privacy. And if I can't do this? If I need to leave? Then you leave, Margaret said simply. You would keep the initial payment and receive prorated compensation for the time you stayed. No penalties, no lawsuits. Nina's mind raced. $400,000 immediately. Even if she only lasted a month, even with prorated payment, it would be enough to start over, to find an apartment, to breathe. But this was marriage. To a stranger, a 31-year-old billionaire who apparently couldn't find a real wife. What's wrong with him? Nina asked suddenly. Margaret blinked. Excuse me? Your son. What's wrong with him? Why can't he find someone who actually wants to marry him? For the first time, Margaret's composure cracked slightly. Not with offense, but with something that looked like pain. Nothing's wrong with him, she said quietly. He's just broken in ways money can't fix. His father died when he was 19. Cancer. Slow, brutal. Christopher watched him waste away for 2 years while trying to save the company his father built. He succeeded, but it cost him something. She paused. He doesn't let people in anymore. He doesn't believe anyone could want him for reasons beyond his wealth. Nina understood that. She'd felt invisible for months now, forgotten, erased by circumstances beyond her control. When would this start? Nina asked. Immediately. If you agree, we would arrange the ceremony within the week. Small, private, legal. You would move into Christopher's home the same day. Nina looked down at the contract again, at the numbers that could save her life, at the terms that felt both generous and terrifying. I need time to think, she said. Margaret nodded, as if she'd expected this. You have until tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. If you agree, sign the contract and bring it to this address. She slid a business card across the table, embossed, elegant, with an address in one of Savannah's most exclusive neighborhoods. Nina picked up the card, the contract, feeling the weight of both. Margaret stood, smoothing her dress. Nina, I wouldn't have approached you if I didn't believe this could help both of you. My son needs someone real, someone grounded, someone who understands loss and survival. Her voice softened. And you need a chance to start over. This could give you both that. Nina couldn't speak. She just nodded. Margaret left cash on the table, more than enough for the untouched food, and walked out with the same grace she'd arrived with. Nina sat alone in the cafe, surrounded by people living normal lives, holding a contract that promised to change everything. That night, Nina sat on her worn couch, the one the movers would take in less than 48 hours, and read the contract 14 times. She looked up Germano online, found articles about his tech innovations, his philanthropy, his refusal to do interviews, found photos of him at galas, tall, dark-haired, intense, always slightly apart from the crowd. She looked up the Germano Philanthropic Trust, saw the programs it funded, the lives it changed. She thought about Michael, about the life they'd planned, the retirement that never came, the future that ended with a heart attack on a Tuesday morning. She thought about the foreclosure notice, the rejection letters, the last 2 years of slow, suffocating failure. And she thought about Margaret's words, a chance to start over. At 2 a.m., Nina picked up a pen. Her hand hovered over the signature line for 10 full minutes. Then she signed. Nina Williams. She stared at her name, at the commitment she'd just made, at the insane offer that might be the only lifeline left. 4 months. A younger billionaire who didn't believe in love. a contract that promised survival, and a terrifying possibility that she might be walking into something far more complicated than either of them expected. The address Margaret had given Nina led to a part of Savannah she'd only ever seen from a distance, where old Southern wealth met modern ambition, where historic oak trees lined streets that curved toward the water, and where houses became estates, became private worlds. Nina's borrowed car, Sherry had insisted, ignoring Nina's protests, felt conspicuously small as she turned onto Germano's street. The GPS announced her arrival, but Nina didn't need technology to tell her she'd reached the right place. The mansion rose before her like something out of an architectural magazine. Not the traditional Southern estate she'd expected, but a modern structure of glass and steel that somehow didn't clash with the landscape. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the morning light, making the entire building appear to glow. Clean lines, sharp angles, expansive spaces visible even from the driveway. It was beautiful. It was intimidating. It was everything Nina's life wasn't. She parked where the driveway widened, her hands gripping the steering wheel long after she'd turned off the engine. The signed contract sat in her purse. The $400,000 would be transferred within 24 hours of the ceremony. Her apartment, what little remained, would be packed and moved by professionals she'd never have to coordinate with. All she had to do was walk through those doors and marry a man she'd never met. Nina forced herself out of the car. Her legs felt unsteady as she walked toward the entrance, carrying her purse and the folder containing the contract. The front door was massive, dark wood and frosted glass, and she stood before it for a full minute before finally pressing the doorbell. A soft chime echoed inside. Footsteps approached. The door opened. Margaret stood there, impeccably dressed as before, but her expression held something Nina hadn't seen at the cafe: relief. "You came," Margaret said. "I signed." Nina held up the folder, her hand only slightly trembling. Margaret's shoulders relaxed. "Come in." The interior matched the exterior's promise. The foyer opened into a massive living space, polished concrete floors, minimalist furniture, art that probably cost more than Nina's entire former nonprofit's annual budget. But it wasn't cold. Somehow, despite the modern aesthetic, the space felt warm. Soft light filtered through those enormous windows. Plants, real, thriving plants, added life to the corners. "Christopher is in his office," Margaret said, leading Nina through the space. "He wanted to meet you before anything becomes official." "Does he know I signed?" "I told him you were considering it." Margaret paused at a hallway. "Nina, my son can be direct. He doesn't do small talk well. He's been hurt, and he's built walls because of it. But he's not cruel. Just guarded." Nina nodded, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Margaret knocked on a door at the end of the hall, then opened it without waiting for a response. "Christopher, Ms. Williams is here." The office was smaller than Nina expected, lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large desk covered in multiple monitors. And behind that desk, standing as they entered, was Christopher Germano. Tall, over 6 feet. Dark hair slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it. Sharp features that might have been handsome if they weren't so tense. But it was his eyes that caught Nina. Dark blue, intense, looking at her with an assessment that felt both clinical and exhausted. He looked exactly like his photos, and nothing like them. The photos showed a confident billionaire. The man before her looked like someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. "Ms. Williams," he said. His voice was deeper than she'd expected, rougher. "Mr. Germano." "Christopher, or Germano. No one calls me Christopher except my mother." He glanced at Margaret, who simply smiled and left, closing the door behind her, leaving Nina alone with the man she'd agreed to marry. For a long moment, neither spoke. Germano studied her with an intensity that made Nina want to look away, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. If they were going to do this, whatever this was, she wouldn't start by being intimidated. "You're older than I expected," Germano said finally. Direct. Margaret had warned her. 46, Nina replied, lifting her chin slightly. 15 years older than you. She waited for judgment, for hesitation, for some sign that he was reconsidering. Instead, something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but close. "Good," he said simply. "Good? The women my mother tried to set me up with before were all in their 20s. They looked at me like I was a prize to be won." He moved around the desk, leaning against it rather than sitting. "You're looking at me like you're trying to decide if I'm insane. Are you?" "Probably," he said. The almost smile flickered again. "But you signed the contract anyway." Nina set her purse on the chair beside her, pulled out the folder, and placed it on his desk. "I signed it because I'm desperate. You should know that going in. I'm not doing this because I think it's romantic, or because I'm fascinated by your wealth. I'm doing it because I'm about to be evicted, and I've run out of options." Germano didn't look offended. If anything, he seemed to relax slightly. "That's the most honest thing anyone's said to me in months," he said. "Most people tell me what they think I want to hear." "I can't afford to lie," Nina said. "Not about this." He picked up the contract, flipping through the pages she'd signed. For a moment, the only sound was paper rustling and the quiet hum of his computer equipment. "My mother explained everything?" he asked, not looking up. "The public appearances, the time commitment, the fact that this is a business arrangement masquerading as a marriage?" Nina finished. "Yes," she was very clear. "And you're comfortable with that?" Nina almost laughed. Comfortable wasn't the word she'd use. Terrified, desperate, uncertain, those fit better. "I'm willing to try," she said instead. Germano set down the contract, his expression shifting to something more serious. "I need you to understand what you're walking into. The media will be interested. People will judge. They'll say things about the age difference, about gold digging, about... I know." Nina's voice came out steadier than she felt. "I spent last night Googling you. I've seen the headlines, the speculation, the photos. I know what I'm signing up for." "Do you?" He pushed away from the desk, pacing to the window. "Because knowing intellectually and experiencing it are different things. I've had photographers follow me to the grocery store. I've had people sell private conversations to tabloids. This won't be easy." "Neither was watching my husband die," Nina said quietly. "Neither was losing everything I'd built over 15 years. Neither was applying to 32 jobs and hearing nothing back." She met his eyes. "I'm not expecting easy, Mr. Germano. I'm expecting survival." He stared at her for a long moment, something unreadable crossing his face. Then he returned to his desk, pulled out a pen, and began writing in the margins of the contract. "What are you doing?" Nina asked. "Revising." He didn't look up. "My mother's version is good, but it's missing things." "Like what?" "Protection." He continued writing. "Mental health clause. If at any point this arrangement becomes psychologically harmful to you, you can terminate immediately with full compensation. No questions asked." Nina blinked. "That's non-negotiable," he interrupted. "Also adding a public pressure clause. If media attention becomes harassment, we reduce public appearances to the absolute minimum required by the trust terms." More writing. "And immediate termination rights that supersede the 30-day notice. If you want out, you walk away that day, with payment." "Why would you do that?" Nina asked, bewildered. You're giving me more power than... Because I won't trap you. Germano finally looked up, and for the first time, Nina saw past the guarded exterior to something raw underneath. I watched my father fight for control over his own life while cancer stole it piece by piece. I watched him lose his autonomy, his dignity, his choices. His voice dropped. I won't be the reason someone else feels trapped. Not ever. The room fell silent. Nina understood then. This wasn't just about a marriage clause or an inheritance. This was about a man who'd lost too much and was trying desperately not to cause the same pain to someone else. Okay, she said softly. Germano finished writing, signed his name with quick precision, then slid the revised contract across the desk to her. Read the changes. Make sure you're comfortable. And if there's anything else you need added, tell me now. Nina read through his additions, each one designed to protect her, to give her exit routes, to ensure she never felt cornered. It was more generous than anything she'd expected. She picked up his pen and initialed each change. Then we have an agreement, Germano said, standing and extending his hand across the desk. Nina stood as well, looking at his offered hand. This was it, the moment that would change everything. She reached out and clasped his hand. His grip was warm, unexpectedly so, firm but not crushing, the handshake of someone who meant what they promised. 4 months, he said. 4 months, Nina echoed. They held the handshake a beat longer than necessary, both seeming to realize the weight of what they'd just committed to. When Nina finally pulled her hand back, it still tingled where his skin had touched hers. Germano cleared his throat, suddenly looking less composed. The ceremony is scheduled for tomorrow. 2 p.m. small, private, just signatures and witnesses. Margaret will help you with whatever you need. Tomorrow? Nina's voice came out higher than intended. The trust deadline is in 3 weeks. We need to start the 4-month clock as soon as possible. He paused. Is that a problem? 24 hours until she became someone's wife. A stranger's wife. A younger billionaire's wife in a contract marriage that promised survival but guaranteed nothing else. No, Nina heard herself say. No problem. Germano nodded, then seemed unsure what to do next. Margaret will show you the room where you'll be staying. If you need anything changed, furniture, paint, whatever, just tell her. Thank you. And Nina? He said her first name for the first time, and something about hearing it in his voice made her chest tighten. I know this is strange. I know it's not what either of us imagined for our lives, but I'll do my best to make it bearable. Bearable. Not happy, not comfortable, just bearable. It was the saddest promise Nina had ever heard. So will I, she said. Margaret led Nina through the mansion to what would become her suite, a bedroom larger than her entire former apartment, with an attached bathroom that could have been featured in a spa magazine, and a sitting area with windows overlooking the water. I'll leave you to process, Margaret said gently, squeezing Nina's shoulder. Tomorrow will come quickly. After Margaret left, Nina stood in the center of the room, surrounded by luxury she'd never expected to experience, holding a contract that promised to save her life. She thought about Germano's exhausted eyes, his protective contract revisions, the warmth of his unexpected handshake. She thought about the wedding tomorrow, about living in this mansion, about pretending to be someone's wife. And she whispered to the empty room, her voice barely audible. What have I just agreed to? The mansion, with all its glass and light and beautiful emptiness, offered no answer. The wedding took place in a small room at the county courthouse, sterile, efficient, devoid of anything resembling romance. Nina wore a simple cream dress Margaret had bought for her, No veil, no flowers, no music. Germano stood beside her in a dark suit, his expression unreadable as the officiant, a tired woman who'd probably performed a dozen ceremonies that day, read through the legal requirements. Do you, Christopher Alexander Germano, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. His voice was steady, businesslike, a signature on a contract. Do you, Nina Williams, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Nina's throat felt tight. She thought about Michael, about the wedding they'd had 20 years ago in a small church with daisies and promises they'd believed would last forever. This wasn't that. This was survival wearing a wedding dress. I do, she whispered. By the power vested in me by the state of Georgia, I now pronounce you husband and wife. No kiss. Germano had specified that in advance. Unnecessary for a legal marriage, he'd said. They simply shook hands again, that same warm grip that confused Nina more than it should have. Margaret signed as witness. So did Germano's attorney, a severe-looking man who said nothing beyond his signature. And just like that, Nina became Mrs. Christopher Germano. The entire ceremony lasted 8 minutes. Moving into the mansion felt surreal. Professional movers had already transported what little Nina owned, mostly clothes, a few books, photographs she couldn't bear to lose. Everything fit into 3 boxes. 3 boxes to represent 46 years of living. The contrast was obscene. Her suite, she couldn't think of it as a room, was larger than her entire former apartment. The bedroom alone could have held her old living room, kitchen, and bedroom combined. The ceilings soared overhead, making her feel small. The bed was enormous, covered in linens that probably cost more than her monthly rent used to be. Everything was beautiful. Everything felt wrong. Nina unpacked her boxes, placing her meager belongings in the massive walk-in closet where they looked lost among the empty shelves and hanging rods. She set Michael's photo on the nightstand, him smiling at a beach they'd visited years ago, and immediately felt like an intruder bringing her past into someone else's present. That first night, she lay in the center of the too-big bed, staring at the ceiling, and felt more alone than she had in the weeks before eviction. At least her old apartment had been hers. This was just expensive emptiness. Germano treated her like a guest in a hotel, polite, distant, careful never to intrude. They crossed paths in the kitchen the second morning. He was already dressed for work, impeccable suit, perfectly styled hair, pouring coffee into a travel mug. Good morning, Nina said, feeling awkward in the oversized space. Morning. He didn't quite meet her eyes. There's coffee made. Help yourself to anything in the kitchen. Margaret left her number on the counter if you need anything. Thank you. He nodded, grabbed his mug, and left. The garage door opened. An engine started. He was gone. Nina stood in the gleaming kitchen, surrounded by appliances she didn't know how to use, and poured herself coffee in silence. Dinners were worse. Margaret insisted they eat together, at least a few times a week, for appearances, she said. The staff needed to believe this was real. The attorney would be checking in. Maintaining the facade started at home, so they sat across from each other at the long dining table, a housekeeper named Rosa serving meals that were too elaborate for 2 people who barely spoke. How was your day? Nina asked the third night, trying. Busy. Germano cut his chicken with surgical precision. Conference calls, contract negotiations, the usual. Sounds stressful. It's fine. Silence. Nina tried again. Margaret mentioned you're working on an education initiative. Yes. One-word answer. Conversation closed. They finished eating without speaking again. During the days, Nina explored Savannah like a ghost haunting her own life. She walked the historic squares, past tourists taking photos and couples holding hands. She sat on benches reading books she borrowed from Germano's extensive library. He had a whole wall of fiction she hadn't expected a tech billionaire to own. She visited the Savannah College of Art and Design's exhibitions. She browsed shops she still couldn't afford despite the money now sitting in her bank account. Old habits died hard. But everywhere she went, she felt disconnected. Not quite poor anymore, but not rich either. Not quite married, but wearing a wedding ring. Not quite herself, but not anyone else either. In between. Liminal. Lost. Margaret became her lifeline. She visited twice during the first week, taking Nina to lunch, asking how she was adjusting. Unlike her son, Margaret actually listened to the answers. "He's avoiding me," Nina said over salads at a cafe downtown. "We barely speak." Margaret sighed. "Christopher is complicated. He agreed to this arrangement logically, but emotionally, he doesn't know how to navigate it. He's used to controlling everything, his business, his schedule, his feelings. You represent something he can't control." "I'm not trying to control anything," Nina said. "I'm just trying to exist in the same house without feeling like I'm intruding." "You're not intruding," Margaret's voice was firm. "You have every right to be there. But my son has spent years building walls. They won't come down overnight." "Maybe they won't come down at all," Nina said quietly. Margaret reached across the table, covering Nina's hand with her own. "Give him time. Give yourself time. You've both been through losses that don't heal quickly." But Nina started noticing things. Small things that cracked the facade Germano maintained so carefully. Like the fact that he worked until 2 or 3 in the morning. She heard him moving through the house, saw lights under his office door when she couldn't sleep. Like the way he snapped at his phone during a business call she accidentally overheard. His voice sharp with frustration he never showed around her. Like the empty whiskey glass she found in the sink one morning. Evidence of a night he needed something to dull whatever kept him awake. Germano wasn't just distant. He was drowning. The breakthrough came during their second week of cohabitation. Nina woke at midnight, restless, and wandered downstairs for water. She found Germano in the living room, sitting in darkness, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the water beyond. He didn't hear her approach. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly. He startled, turning. In the dim light from outside, he looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, hair disheveled like he'd been running his hands through it. "Never can," he admitted, too tired to guard his words. Nina hesitated, then sat in the chair across from him. "How long has it been?" "Since I slept well?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Years, since my father got sick. Before that, probably." "Have you tried medication, therapy, meditation?" "Yes." He rubbed his face. "Nothing works. My brain doesn't shut off." Nina understood that. She'd spent months after Michael's death lying awake, replaying every conversation, every missed sign, every moment she couldn't get back. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Right now?" Germano looked at her, seeming to decide whether to answer honestly. Then, "Whether I'm destroying your life." The confession caught Nina off guard. "What?" "You agreed to this because you were desperate. I took advantage of that. And now you're trapped in this house with a stranger who barely speaks to you, who works too much, who can't even manage basic human interaction." His voice cracked slightly. "My mother thinks I need someone grounded and real. But maybe I'm just selfish enough to trap someone else in my mess." Nina's chest ached, hearing the self-recrimination in his words. "You're not trapping me," she said firmly. "I signed that contract knowing exactly what I was agreeing to, and you gave me every exit route possible. That's not selfish, Germano. That's the opposite." "Is it?" He looked back out the window. Because from where I'm sitting, I bought myself a wife to secure an inheritance. That's pretty much the definition of selfish. You secured an inheritance to protect a philanthropic trust worth billions that helps people, Nina countered. That's not selfish either. He was quiet for a moment. Then, why aren't you angry with me? Why would I be? Because I haven't made this easy. Because I've barely spoken to you. Because you're grieving, Nina interrupted gently. I recognize it because I lived it. The insomnia, the overworking, the walls. I did all of it after Michael died. For months, I barely functioned. I just existed, moved through motions. Germano finally looked at her fully, and for the first time she saw recognition in his eyes. Not of her specifically, but of what she'd experienced. How did you get through it? He asked quietly. Honestly? Nina's voice softened. I'm not sure I have completely, but I learned that grief doesn't follow a schedule. It just sits with you. Some days it's background noise. Other days it's everything. They sat in silence for a while, two people who'd lost too much, sitting in expensive darkness, finally acknowledging the wounds neither had healed from. I miss him, Germano said suddenly. My father. I still reach for my phone to call him about business decisions. And then I remember. I keep Michael's birthday card in my purse, Nina admitted. The last one he gave me. Sometimes I take it out and read it, just to remember what his handwriting looked like. Germano's expression shifted. Still sad, but less alone. We're quite a pair, aren't we? He said with a ghost of a smile. The broken billionaire and the widow pretending to be married. Technically, we are married, Nina pointed out. Technically, he agreed. And then, unexpectedly, he smiled, really smiled. Though I don't think this is what either of us imagined for our wedding night, sitting in the dark, discussing grief and insomnia. Nina found herself smiling back. Definitely not what the romance novels promise. You read romance novels? Occasionally, when I need to remember that happy endings exist somewhere. Do they? Germano asked. Exist? I don't know, Nina said honestly, but I think people keep looking anyway. Something shifted between them then. Not romance, not yet, but recognition, understanding. The beginning of something that felt less like a business arrangement and more like two people trying to survive. Thank you, Germano said quietly, for not treating me like I'm broken. You're not broken, Nina said. You're just human. There's a difference. He held her gaze for a long moment, and Nina felt her chest tighten with something she didn't want to name yet. Then Rose's cat, Nina hadn't even known they had a cat, jumped onto the coffee table between them, meowing indignantly at being ignored. Both of them startled, then laughed. Actually laughed. The cat, a massive orange tabby, began purring loudly, demanding attention. That's Wellington, Germano said, scratching behind the cat's ears. He runs this house more than I do. I didn't know you had a cat. I didn't want one. He showed up 2 years ago and refused to leave. Margaret insisted I keep him. The cat bumped his head against Germano's hand. He's better company than most people. Nina reached out tentatively, and Wellington immediately transferred his affections to her, climbing into her lap and kneading her legs with sharp claws. He likes you, Germano observed. He doesn't like most people. Maybe he recognizes a fellow refugee, Nina said, stroking the cat's soft fur. They sat together in the darkness, Nina, Germano, and Wellington, no longer quite strangers, no longer quite alone. Eventually, Germano stood. I should try to sleep. Early meeting tomorrow. Good luck, Nina said. He paused at the doorway, looking back. Nina, I'm glad you're here, even if I've been terrible at showing it. Her throat tightened. Me too. After he left, Nina sat with Wellington, purring in her lap, looking around the enormous living room that had felt so empty just days ago. It still felt too big, but somehow, it didn't feel quite as empty anymore. The shift happened gradually, like ice melting under spring sun. 3 weeks into their marriage, Margaret invited Nina to attend a philanthropic trust board meeting. Just to observe, she said. You have nonprofit experience. Your perspective might be valuable. Nina expected to sit in the corner, invisible, listening to financial jargon she barely understood. Instead, Germano looked up when she entered the conference room and pulled out the chair beside him. Nina, he said to the assembled board members, older men and women who looked at her with polite curiosity. My wife has 15 years of nonprofit experience. She understands the communities we're trying to serve better than most of us in this room. The meeting proceeded. They discussed funding allocations for education programs, housing initiatives, healthcare access. Nina listened, taking mental notes, trying not to feel out of place among people who discussed millions of dollars like pocket change. Then one of the board members, a silver-haired man named Richard, proposed cutting funding to an after-school program in a low-income neighborhood. The metrics don't justify the expenditure, Richard said, pulling up spreadsheets. Participation rates are below projections. Nina felt her chest tighten. She knew those numbers. She'd worked with programs like that for years. The metrics never told the full story. Before she could stop herself, she spoke. May I ask a question? The room turned to her. Germano's eyes met hers, and he nodded slightly. The participation metrics, Nina continued, her voice steadier than she felt. Do they account for transportation barriers? Because low-income families often can't get their kids to after-school programs. The issue isn't interest. It's access. Richard frowned. We can't fund transportation for every... What if the program went to them? Nina interrupted. Mobile programming. Partner with schools, community centers, churches. Meet families where they are instead of expecting them to come to you. Silence. Then Germano leaned forward, his expression intent. That's brilliant. Richard, table the funding cut. I want proposals for mobile programming by next week. The meeting continued, but Nina felt Germano's gaze on her several times, thoughtful, assessing. Afterward, as the board members filed out, he caught her arm gently. That was impressive, he said. I just know how these programs work, Nina replied, feeling self-conscious. No, you understand the people behind the metrics. That's rare. He paused. Would you be willing to review other proposals? Give your perspective? Nina blinked. You want my opinion? I'm asking for it, aren't I? Something warm unfurled in her chest. Okay. Yes. His almost smile appeared. Good. Dinners became less tense. Germano started asking her questions, real ones, not polite small talk. What did she think about the housing initiative? Had she seen the draft proposal for the healthcare expansion? Did the education budget allocation make sense? Nina answered honestly, and he listened. Actually listened, taking notes sometimes, nodding, pushing back when he disagreed but never dismissing her perspective. One evening, Rosa served pasta, and Wellington jumped onto Nina's lap mid-meal, purring loudly. He's shameless, Germano said, amused. He knows I'm a soft touch, Nina replied, scratching behind the cat's ears. You feed him treats when you think I'm not watching. Nina's cheeks flushed. He looks at me with those eyes. He manipulates you with those eyes, Germano corrected. But he was smiling fully now. Not the guarded almost smile, but something genuine. Says the man who built him a custom cat tower, Nina shot back. That was Margaret. Margaret told me you designed it yourself. Germano's smile widened. Traitor. They laughed together, easy and natural, and Nina realized this was the first truly comfortable meal they'd shared. Later, as she helped clear dishes despite Rosa's protests, she caught Germano watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she asked. "Nothing." He looked away quickly. "Just thank you for being here." "It's in the contract," Nina said lightly. "Still, thank you." Nina began noticing his gentleness, the way he quietly donated to Rosa's granddaughter's medical fund without mentioning it. Nina only found out because Rosa cried while making breakfast one morning. The way he spent 20 minutes on the phone talking his teenage neighbor through a college application essay, patient and encouraging despite his packed schedule. The way he left books he thought she'd enjoy on the kitchen counter, always her favorite genres, always with a sticky note saying simply, "Thought you might like this." Germano wasn't just wealthy and successful. Beneath the armor he'd built around himself, he was kind. And Nina was terrified by how much that mattered to her. The gala invitation arrived with 2 weeks' notice. "Savannah Community Foundation's annual fundraiser," Margaret explained, showing Nina the elegant card. "It's the first major public event you'll attend as a couple. Black tie, high profile, impossible to avoid." Nina's stomach dropped. "How many people?" 300, including several journalists." 300, Nina repeated weakly. "You'll be fine," Margaret assured her. "Christopher will be with you the entire time." That didn't calm her nerves as much as it should have. Margaret took Nina shopping, a boutique with dresses that cost more than Nina's former monthly rent. They settled on a midnight blue gown, elegant and understated, that made Nina feel like someone she barely recognized in the mirror. "You look beautiful," Margaret said softly. "Christopher won't be able to take his eyes off you." Nina's heart did something complicated in her chest. The night of the gala arrived too quickly. Nina spent an hour getting ready, her hands shaking as she applied makeup. The dress fit perfectly, hugging her curves in ways that felt both empowering and terrifying. She'd left her hair down, soft waves that Rosa had helped style. She looked like someone who belonged at a high society event. She felt like an imposter waiting to be exposed. A knock on her suite door made her jump. "Nina, are you ready?" Germano's voice came through. She opened the door and forgot how to breathe. Germano stood in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, looking like he'd stepped out of a magazine. His dark hair was styled impeccably. His blue eyes were sharp, focused. And then he saw her. His expression shifted, something crossing his face too quickly for Nina to identify. He stared for a long moment, and she felt heat rising in her cheeks. "Is it too much?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. Margaret picked it, but if it's... "You're stunning," Germano said, his voice rougher than usual. Nina's breath caught. "I mean..." He cleared his throat. "You look appropriate for the event. Professional." "Oh." Disappointment she had no right to feel settled in her chest. "Thank you." But as they walked to the car, she caught him glancing at her repeatedly, his jaw tight. The gala was held at Hotel Bardo, a beautifully restored historic building with soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers. Cocktails were being served in Bar Bibi when they arrived, the space already crowded with Savannah's elite. Women in designer gowns, men in expensive tuxedos, everyone radiating wealth and confidence. Nina's anxiety spiked. Then Germano placed his hand on her lower back, gentle, grounding, warm even through the fabric of her dress. "Stay close," he said quietly. "And if you need to leave at any point, just tell me." The protective gesture steadied her more than words could have. They moved through the crowd, Germano introducing her to various people, business associates, foundation directors, donors. His hand never left her back, a constant presence that made her feel anchored rather than adrift. "Mrs. Germano," a woman in red silk purred, looking Nina up and down with barely concealed assessment. "How lovely to finally meet Christopher's wife. You're quite different from his usual type." Nina felt the implied insult. Different meaning older, less glamorous, less appropriate. Before she could respond, Germano's hand pressed more firmly against her back, and his voice turned cool. "Nina is exactly my type," he said, steel beneath the polite words. "Intelligent, grounded, accomplished. Everything I've ever wanted in a partner." The woman blinked, taken aback. Germano guided Nina away before she could say anything else. "Thank you," Nina whispered. "She's always been insufferable," Germano muttered. "Ignore her." But later, during dinner, Nina overheard two women at a nearby table. 15 years older, I heard," one whispered. "Gold digger, obviously." "Desperate times," the other replied with a laugh. "Though what he sees in someone that age—" Nina's chest tightened, old insecurities flooding back. She looked down at her plate, appetite gone. Then Germano's hand found hers under the table. She startled, looking up to find him watching her, his expression fierce. "Don't listen to them," he said quietly. "They don't know anything about you, about us." "They're not wrong, though," Nina said, trying to smile. "I am 15 years older, and I did need—" "You needed help, and I offered it," Germano interrupted firmly. "That doesn't make you a gold digger. It makes you human. And anyone who thinks age defines a person's worth isn't worth your concern." He squeezed her hand gently, and Nina felt something shift in her chest, something dangerous and warm and terrifying. After dinner, the music started. Couples moved to the dance floor, and Nina hoped desperately that they could avoid. "Dance with me," Germano said, standing and offering his hand. Not a question, a request that sounded more like a need. Nina took his hand, letting him lead her to the dance floor. The music was slow, romantic, meant for couples who actually loved each other. Germano pulled her close, one hand on her waist, the other holding hers. Their bodies aligned in ways that made Nina hyper-aware of every point of contact. "I don't really know how to dance," she admitted, nervous. "Just follow my lead," he said softly. "I've got you." They moved together, and somehow Nina's body knew how to follow his. His hand was warm on her waist, grounding and electric at once. She could feel his heartbeat through his chest, steady and strong. "You're doing well tonight," he said after a moment. "I know this isn't easy." "It's terrifying," Nina admitted. "But having you there helps." His hand tightened on her waist slightly. "Nina," she looked up, meeting his eyes, and the intensity there stole her breath. They weren't pretending anymore. Whatever this was, this charged electricity between them, this pull she felt every time he looked at her, every time he touched her. It had stopped being an act somewhere along the way. "Germano," she whispered, not even sure what she was asking for. He pulled her infinitesimally closer, and Nina's heart raced. His eyes dropped to her lips for just a second, before returning to her eyes. The song ended. Reality crashed back. They separated slightly, and Nina felt the loss of his warmth like physical pain. "We should—" Germano's voice was rough. "There are more people we should speak to." "Right," Nina managed. "Of course." But as they moved through the rest of the evening, more introductions, more conversations, more performances of being a married couple, Nina couldn't stop replaying the dance. The way he'd held her, the way he'd looked at her, the way she'd felt in his arms. She was falling for him, actually falling for the man she'd married out of desperation, and she had no idea what to do about it. Later, in the car heading home, they sat in silence. The tension between them was different now, charged, heavy with things neither of them knew how to say. Tonight was, Nina started. Exhausting, Germano finished. Then quieter. But it would have been unbearable without you. Nina turned to look at him. In the dim light from passing street lamps, his profile was sharp, beautiful, sad. What do you mean? She asked softly. I hate those events. The performance, the judgment, the superficiality. He glanced at her, and his expression softened. But having you there made it bearable. More than bearable. It made it... He trailed off, seeming unsure. Made it what? Worth it, he said finally. You made it worth it. Nina's breath caught, her heart doing dangerous things in her chest. They pulled into the mansion's driveway, and the moment broke. But as they walked inside, as they said goodnight in the hallway, as Nina closed the door to her suite, she knew everything had changed. She was falling in love with her contract husband, and she was terrified he might be falling too. The call came during dinner. Nina and Germano were sharing pasta, a routine that had become comfortable over the past month. Wellington was draped across Nina's lap, purring contentedly. They'd been discussing a new education proposal, arguing playfully about implementation strategies. Then Germano's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, and his entire body tensed. I need to take this. He left the table without another word, disappearing into his office. Nina heard his voice through the closed door, sharp, controlled, increasingly strained. 20 minutes passed. An hour. 2 hours. Nina cleaned up dinner, fed Wellington, tried to read in the living room, but she couldn't focus, couldn't ignore the tight knot of worry in her chest. She heard Germano's voice rise once, loud enough to carry through the walls, edged with something that sounded like desperation. Then silence. Complete, terrible silence. By midnight, Nina couldn't stand it anymore. She made coffee, strong, black, the way he took it when he worked late, carried the mug down the hallway toward his office, her heart hammering. The door was closed, no light visible underneath. She knocked softly. Germano? No response. I brought coffee. I thought you might... Go away. His voice was rough, broken. Nothing like the composed billionaire she'd married. Nina hesitated. Every instinct told her to respect his privacy, to walk away, to let him handle whatever had happened alone. But she'd spent months after Michael's death wishing someone had pushed past her walls, had refused to let her drown in isolation. She opened the door. The office was dark except for the glow of computer monitors. Germano sat at his desk, hunched forward, head in his hands. Papers were scattered everywhere, some crumpled, some torn. His jacket lay discarded on the floor. His tie hung loose around his neck. He didn't look up when she entered. The deal collapsed, he said flatly. 3 years of work. Hundreds of millions invested. Partnership with a European tech firm that would have revolutionized our platform. His hands clenched in his hair. Gone. Because one board member changed his vote. One person. Nina set the coffee on his desk, her chest aching at the defeat in his voice. I'm sorry, she said softly. My father built this company from nothing, Germano continued, as if she hadn't spoken. He poured everything into it, died trying to save it. And his voice cracked. I just destroyed the biggest expansion opportunity we've ever had. You didn't destroy anything, Nina said firmly. A board member changed their mind. That's not your fault, isn't it? He finally looked up, and Nina's breath caught at what she saw. His eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted, haunted. Maybe I pushed too hard. Maybe I missed something in the negotiation. Maybe I'm not... He stopped, jaw clenching. Maybe I'm not good enough for this. The words hit Nina like physical blows. This wasn't just about a business deal. This was years of pressure, of trying to live up to a dead father's legacy, of carrying impossible expectations while grieving privately. "Germano," she said quietly, moving closer. "Don't." He held up a hand, stopping her. "Don't try to make me feel better. Don't tell me it'll be fine. I don't need—" His voice broke completely. Nina saw it happen, the exact moment his carefully constructed armor finally shattered. His shoulders shook. His breath came in ragged gasps. He was falling apart, and he was trying desperately not to let her see. She didn't think. She just moved. Nina crossed the space between them and placed her hand gently on his shoulder. Germano went completely still. "It's okay," she whispered. "You don't have to hold it together right now." That was all it took. He broke. Completely. Devastatingly broke. A sound escaped him. Half sob, half exhale. And then he was standing, turning, and suddenly Nina's arms were full of him. Germano collapsed against her, his full weight pressing her backward against the desk, his face buried in her shoulder, his entire body shaking with the force of emotions he'd been holding back for years. Nina wrapped her arms around him instinctively, holding him as tightly as she could. One hand cradled the back of his head, her fingers threading through his hair. The other pressed against his back, feeling the tremors that racked through him. He wasn't crying, not quite, but he was breathing like he'd been drowning and had just broken the surface. Harsh, desperate breaths that spoke of years of suppressed grief and pressure and loneliness. "I've got you," Nina murmured, holding him tighter. "I've got you. Let it out." His arms came around her waist, clinging to her like she was the only solid thing in a world that had stopped making sense. His hands fisted in the fabric of her shirt. His breath was hot against her neck. They stood like that. Nina's back pressed against the desk, Germano's body curved around hers, both of them trembling, for what felt like hours. Nina had held her husband when he'd been sick. She'd held friends through breakups, colleagues through crises. But this felt different. This felt like holding someone who'd been alone for so long, they'd forgotten what it meant to be held. "I'm sorry," Germano finally whispered against her shoulder, his voice wrecked. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't—" "Stop," Nina interrupted softly. "Stop apologizing. I'm supposed to be—" He took a shuddering breath. "I'm supposed to be strong. In control, I can't—" "You're human," Nina said, her own voice thick with emotion. "You're allowed to break sometimes." His grip on her tightened, and for a moment she thought he might pull away. Instead, he pressed closer, as if trying to disappear into her embrace. "Why are you kind to me?" he whispered, the question barely audible. "I brought you into this mess. I'm paying you to pretend to be my wife. You don't owe me anything. Why are you here?" Nina's heart cracked open. She pulled back just enough to see his face, tear-stained, vulnerable, beautiful in its brokenness. "Because you deserve kindness," she said simply. "You've spent so long taking care of everyone else, the company, the trust, your employees, but no one's taking care of you." She reached up, wiping tears from his cheeks with her thumbs. "You deserve someone who sees you. Not the billionaire, not the CEO, just you." Germano stared at her, his dark blue eyes searching hers, something desperate and hopeful and terrified flickering across his face. "Nina," he breathed, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. His hands came up to cup her face, and for a heartbeat, Nina thought he might kiss her. His gaze dropped to her lips, his breathing unsteady. She could feel his heartbeat against her chest, racing and wild. She wanted him to. God help her, she wanted him to kiss her more than she'd wanted anything in years. But then reality seemed to crash back. Germano pulled away abruptly, stepping back, running his hands through his hair with a shaky laugh that held no humor. "I'm a mess," he said roughly. I shouldn't have." "Germano, thank you," he interrupted, not meeting her eyes. "For the coffee, for everything. But you should go, get some sleep." It was a dismissal. A retreat back behind walls that had cracked but not crumbled. Nina wanted to argue, to tell him he didn't have to face this alone, that she wasn't leaving. But she saw the panic in his eyes, the fear of what he'd just revealed, of how vulnerable he'd been, of what it might mean. "Okay," she said softly. "But if you need anything—" "I know." His voice gentled slightly. "I know where to find you." Nina left the office, closing the door behind her with a soft click. She stood in the hallway for a long moment, her own hands shaking, her heart racing. She could still feel him, the weight of his body against hers, the desperate grip of his hands, the ragged sound of his breathing, could still feel the exact rhythm of his heartbeat where his chest had pressed against hers. Nina didn't sleep. She lay in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment. The way he'd broken in her arms, the way he'd whispered her name, the way he'd looked at her like she was the only thing keeping him from falling apart completely. The way she'd wanted him to kiss her, the way she'd wanted to kiss him back. This wasn't supposed to happen. They had a contract. 4 months. A business arrangement designed to save them both. Him from losing his inheritance, her from losing everything she had left. But somewhere in the dinners and the board meetings and the late-night conversations, somewhere between the gala dance and Wellington's purring presence and the way Germano had defended her to cruel strangers, somewhere along the way, Nina had stopped pretending. She'd fallen in love with him. Actually, completely, terrifyingly in love with the broken billionaire who'd offered her survival and accidentally given her something to live for again. And tonight, holding him while he shattered, feeling his heartbeat against her own, Nina had realized something else. He might be falling too. The realization should have been joyful. Instead, it was terrifying, because in less than 2 months, their contract would expire. And Nina had no idea if what they'd built in the pretending was strong enough to survive the truth. As dawn light began filtering through her windows, Nina finally heard movement from elsewhere in the house. Germano's office door opening, his footsteps in the hallway, hesitating briefly outside her suite before continuing to his own room. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her own heartbeat, still racing, still remembering the rhythm of his. Everything had changed tonight. They'd crossed a line neither of them could uncross, and Nina had no idea what came next. The morning after Germano broke in her arms, Nina woke to find a book on her nightstand. Not just any book, a first edition of The House on Mango Street, one she'd mentioned loving during a late-night conversation weeks ago. A sticky note in Germano's handwriting read simply, "Thank you for last night." Nina pressed the note to her chest, her heart doing complicated things. Everything had shifted. The touches came first. Germano's hand lingering on hers when passing her coffee, his fingers brushing her lower back as they moved through the kitchen. The way he steadied her elbow when she stumbled slightly on the stairs, his grip warm and reluctant to let go. Small things, innocent things, things that set Nina's skin on fire. One evening, while reviewing trust proposals at the dining table, their hands reached for the same document. Their fingers tangled together, and instead of pulling away immediately, they both froze. Germano's thumb brushed across her knuckles, once, twice, before he finally withdrew. "Sorry," he murmured, not meeting her eyes. "It's fine," Nina whispered, though her hand still tingled where he'd touched her, Wellington, sitting between them, meowed judgmentally. The late-night conversations became routine. Nina would find Germano in the living room at midnight, staring out at the water. She'd join him without asking, and they'd talk for hours, about everything and nothing. His childhood dreams of being an architect, her secret love of terrible reality TV, the father he'd lost, the husband she still missed. "Do you think Michael would approve?" Germano asked one night. "Of this arrangement?" Nina considered. "He'd hate that I was desperate enough to need it. But he'd like you." "Would he?" "You're kind beneath all the walls. He always valued kindness above everything else." Germano looked at her with an intensity that made breathing difficult. "You see things in me I'm not sure exist anymore." "They exist," Nina said softly. "You just forgot they were there." His hand found hers in the darkness, threading their fingers together. They sat like that until dawn, holding hands like teenagers, neither willing to be the first to let go. The gifts continued. Nina left Germano a stress ball shaped like a cat after noticing how often he clenched his fists during conference calls. She found it on his desk the next day, well used. He surprised her with a pottery class registration, something she'd mentioned wanting to try years ago but never had time for. She made his favorite meal when he'd had a particularly brutal day. He bought her a lap blanket in exactly the shade of blue she loved, placing it on her chair without comment. They were courting each other, Nina realized with a jolt. Actually courting, despite being already married, despite the contract that said this was temporary, despite every logical reason they shouldn't. Margaret noticed. "You're glowing," she said during one of their lunches, studying Nina with knowing eyes. "I'm not." "You are, and my son can't stop staring at you when he thinks no one's watching." Margaret's smile was gentle. "I'm glad, Nina. Whatever's developing between you two, I'm glad." Nina's throat tightened. "The contract expires in 5 weeks. Contracts can be renegotiated," Margaret said simply, "if both parties want them to be." Sherry noticed during a phone call. "You sound different," her best friend said suspiciously. "Happier. What aren't you telling me?" "Nothing," Nina lied. "Nina Williams, I've known you for 20 years. You're in love with him, aren't you?" The accusation hung in the air. "It's complicated," Nina whispered. "Love always is, but Nina, if he makes you happy, we have a contract, an expiration date. This was never supposed to be real." "Honey, from everything you've told me, it already is real. The question is whether you're both brave enough to admit it." Even Rosa noticed, giving Nina significant looks when Germano touched her hand at breakfast, when he laughed at something she said, when he watched her leave the room with undisguised longing. "Mr. Germano, he is different now," Rosa said one afternoon while Nina helped with dishes. "Lighter, less alone, because of you." "We're just," Nina started. "Playing pretend?" Rosa smiled. "No, Mrs. Germano. You stopped pretending weeks ago, both of you." But Nina was terrified. She'd lost Michael unexpectedly, devastatingly, had spent 2 years rebuilding herself from grief only to nearly lose everything again. This, whatever was growing between her and Germano, felt too fragile, too impossible. He was 15 years younger, wealthy beyond her comprehension. He could have anyone, and she was just the desperate widow he'd married out of convenience. So Nina tried to pull back, tried to protect her heart from the inevitable moment when reality crashed through their bubble. She declined his invitation to watch a documentary one evening, claiming exhaustion. She kept her distance during a trust meeting, sitting across the table instead of beside him. She forced herself not to join him for their late-night talks, staying in her room even when she heard him moving through the house, clearly waiting for her. Germano noticed immediately. And he pulled away too, that familiar guardedness returning to his expression. Dinners became tense again. He worked longer hours. He stopped leaving her gifts. For 3 days, they circled each other like wounded animals, both too afraid to reach out, both aching with the distance. Then Wellington got sick. Nina found the cat lethargic and unresponsive one morning and immediately called Germano, panic in her voice. He left work instantly, driving them to the emergency vet, his hand gripping Nina's the entire way. "He'll be okay," Nina whispered, as much to herself as to Germano. "He has to be okay." "He's a fighter," Germano said, but his voice shook. They sat in the waiting room for hours, shoulders pressed together, hands still clasped. When the vet finally emerged saying Wellington would recover, just a severe hairball blockage, they both sagged with relief. On the drive home, Germano said quietly, "I hate this." "Hate what?" "The distance. Whatever's happening between us." He glanced at her, pain clear in his eyes. "I know you're pulling away. I understand why. But Nina, I can't—" He stopped, jaw clenching. "I don't know how to do this anymore. The pretending." "Neither do I," Nina whispered. The tension between them became unbearable after that. It broke on a Thursday evening, 6 weeks into their marriage. Germano found Nina on the rooftop terrace, a space she'd discovered and claimed as her own for evening reading. The sky was ablaze with sunset colors, oranges and pinks and purples bleeding together like watercolors. "Can I join you?" he asked, hovering at the doorway. Nina's heart leapt. "Of course." He sat beside her on the outdoor couch, close enough that their thighs almost touched. For a long moment, they just watched the sunset in silence. Then Germano spoke. "Nina, I need to tell you something." His voice was rough, uncertain. "And I need you to let me finish before you respond." Nina's chest tightened. "Okay." He took a shaky breath. "This arrangement, this marriage, it was supposed to be temporary. A solution to a problem. 4 months and done." He turned to face her fully. "But somewhere along the way, it stopped feeling like an arrangement, and I can't pretend anymore that it's still just business." Nina couldn't breathe. "When I'm with you," Germano continued, "I'm not the CEO or the heir or the broken man trying to live up to his father's legacy. I'm just me. And you see me, actually see me, in ways no one else does." His hand found hers, trembling. "This isn't fake anymore, Nina. Whatever we're doing, whatever this is, it's real for me. Terrifyingly, completely real." Tears burned Nina's eyes. "Germano!" "I'm not asking you to feel the same way," he said quickly. "I know I'm younger. I know this wasn't what you signed up for. I know—" "Stop," Nina interrupted, placing her free hand on his cheek. "Just stop." He went still, his eyes searching hers desperately. "You think you're the only one who stopped pretending?" Nina's voice shook. "I've been falling for you since that first night you couldn't sleep. Since you revised the contract to protect me. Since you defended me at the gala like I was someone worth defending." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I tried to pull away because I'm terrified. Because losing Michael nearly destroyed me. And losing you—" "You won't lose me," Germano said fiercely. "You don't know that. The contract expires in 5 weeks. You could wake up one day and realize this was just Nina." He cupped her face with both hands. "Look at me." She did, and the intensity in his eyes stole her breath. "I'm in love with you," he said simply. "Not the idea of you, not the convenience of you. You, the woman who brings me coffee when I'm drowning, who challenges me in board meetings, who holds me when I fall apart, who makes this massive house feel like home for the first time in my life." Nina's heart shattered and rebuilt simultaneously. "I love you too," she whispered. "I'm completely, impossibly in love with you." The confession hung between them, raw and real and terrifying. Germano's gaze dropped to her lips. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. Nina didn't pull away. She leaned in too, her eyes fluttering closed, her heart racing. His phone rang, loud, jarring, destroying the moment. They both froze, foreheads almost touching, breathing the same air. "Don't answer it," Nina whispered. The phone kept ringing. Germano closed his eyes, pain flickering across his face. "It's the trust attorney, about the inheritance deadline. I have to—" He pulled away, and Nina felt the loss like physical pain. "Germano speaking," he answered, his voice strained. He listened, his expression growing tense. "Yes, tomorrow morning. I understand." He hung up, running his hand through his hair with a shaky laugh that held no humor. "They need documentation proving the marriage is legitimate. Photos, joint appearances, witnesses." He looked at her helplessly. "The deadline is in 2 weeks. Everything has to be verified before then." Reality crashed back. The contract, the trust, the reason they'd married in the first place. "Of course," Nina said, though her lips still tingled with the ghost of the kiss that almost happened. "Nina, we should go inside," she interrupted, standing on unsteady legs. "It's getting cold." "Nina, please, we just need to be careful," Nina said, wrapping her arms around herself. 2 more weeks until the contract is fulfilled. Then we can figure out what this is, what we are." But as she walked past him toward the door, Germano caught her hand. "I know what we are," he said softly. "The question is whether you're brave enough to believe it." Nina looked back at him. This beautiful, broken man who'd offered her survival and accidentally given her love, and felt her heart crack open. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "So am I." He squeezed her hand gently. "But I'd rather be terrified with you than safe with anyone else." That night, Nina lay in bed, her fingers pressed to her lips, imagining the kiss that had almost happened. She could still feel the warmth of his breath, the tremor in his hands, the way he'd looked at her like she was everything. "I'm in love with you." The words echoed in her mind, more precious than any contract, more valuable than any payment. Germano loved her, and she loved him. But they had 2 weeks until the trust was secure. 2 weeks where one wrong move could destroy everything, the inheritance, the trust, the fragile thing growing between them. Nina rolled over, staring at the wall that separated her room from his. On the other side, she heard movement, pacing, the same restless energy she felt. They were both awake, both shaking, both terrified of the truth they'd finally spoken. Tomorrow, they would go back to being careful, to fulfilling contract requirements, to playing the roles they'd been assigned. But everything had changed on that rooftop. They'd stopped pretending, and there was no going back. After the rooftop confession, everything became simultaneously easier and impossibly harder. They'd admitted they loved each other. The words had been spoken, raw and real and terrifying, but nothing had actually changed. The contract still had an expiration date, 11 days now. The trust attorney still needed documentation. The world still saw them as a temporary arrangement, a business transaction dressed up as marriage, and neither of them knew how to bridge the gap between what they'd confessed in private and what they could acknowledge in public. So they didn't talk about it. They moved around each other carefully, like 2 people navigating a minefield. Every conversation felt loaded with things they weren't saying. Every touch lingered too long and ended too quickly. Every glance held promises neither of them knew how to keep. Nina caught Germano staring at her during breakfast, his expression achingly tender. When she met his eyes, he looked away quickly, returning to his coffee like nothing had happened. She reached for his hand once while they reviewed trust documents. He threaded their fingers together, his thumb tracing circles on her palm, then pulled away when Rosa entered the room, the connection severed by the need to maintain appearances. They were in love, and they were trapped by the very contract that had brought them together. The trust fundraiser arrived with 4 days left until the deadline. Another high-profile event, this one even larger than the gala. 500 attendees, including the trust board members who would be verifying their marriage's legitimacy. Nina wore emerald green this time, a dress that made her feel beautiful and exposed in equal measure. Germano's reaction when he saw her, the sharp intake of breath, the way his eyes darkened, made her skin flush with heat. "You're stunning," he said, his voice low. "You've said that before," Nina replied, trying for lightness. "I'll keep saying it until you believe me." The charged moment stretched between them before reality intruded. The car was waiting. The event demanded their presence. They had roles to play. At the fundraiser, they moved through the crowd with practiced ease now. Germano's hand stayed on her lower back, no longer just for show, but because neither of them could stand not touching. Nina leaned into him naturally when people spoke to them, her body seeking his warmth. To everyone watching, they looked like a couple deeply in love. The irony wasn't lost on Nina. They were finally real, but still performing. "Mrs. Germano," a board member named Harrison approached, his wife beside him. "Lovely to see you again. And how are you enjoying married life?" The question felt like a test. "It's been wonderful," Nina said, the truth and the lie tangled together. "Christopher is—" She glanced at Germano, finding him already watching her. "He's more than I expected." Germano's hand tightened on her waist, and she saw something vulnerable flash across his face. "Young love," Harrison's wife sighed. "Though I must say, the age difference is quite irrelevant," Germano interrupted smoothly, steel beneath the polite tone. "Nina's the best thing that's ever happened to me, regardless of when we were born." The words should have felt performative. Instead, they felt like a confession wrapped in a defense. The breaking point came during cocktail hour. Nina had stepped away to the restroom, needing a moment to breathe. When she returned, she found a man talking to Germano, someone she didn't recognize, handsome and polished in an expensive suit. But it wasn't the stranger who caught her attention. It was the woman standing nearby, the same one in red silk from the previous gala, the one who'd made snide comments about Nina's age. "Poor thing," the woman was saying to her companion, just loud enough to carry. "She probably thinks this is permanent, that he'll actually keep her around after the trust is secured." Nina froze. 4 months, the companion replied with a laugh. "That's all the contract specifies. Once he has his inheritance, he'll trade up for someone more appropriate." "Someone younger, you mean?" Red Silk added. "Someone who actually belongs in his world." The words hit like physical blows. Nina's chest tightened, old insecurities flooding back with vicious force. Temporary. That's all she was. All she'd ever been. A convenience. A solution to a problem. The confession on the rooftop, had that been real? Or had she misread everything? Seen love where there was only gratitude? Mistaken kindness for something deeper? She turned away before they could see her, retreating to the bar and ordering wine she didn't want. "Nina?" She startled. The stranger from earlier, the one who'd been talking to Germano, stood beside her, smiling warmly. "I'm sorry. Do we know each other?" Nina asked. "David Chen. I run a nonprofit housing initiative. We've applied for trust funding several times." He extended his hand. "I wanted to introduce myself earlier, but you were surrounded. Your work in community outreach is impressive. I've read about your programs." Nina shook his hand, surprised. "Thank you. That was a lifetime ago." "Hardly. Your perspective in the last board meeting was brilliant, The mobile programming idea. That's someone who understands ground-level work. He pulled out a business card. I'd love to pick your brain sometime. Maybe collaborate on a proposal? It was professional, friendly, nothing more. But when Nina glanced up, she found Germano watching from across the room, his expression dark. The car ride home was silent. Germano stared out the window, his jaw tight, one hand clenched into a fist on his thigh. Nina sat as far away as the seat allowed, replaying the women's words on repeat. Temporary. Trade up. Doesn't belong. Who was that? Germano asked suddenly, his voice clipped. Who? The man. At the bar. Nina blinked. David Chen. He runs a housing nonprofit. I know who he is, Germano interrupted. What did he want? The edge in his voice sparked something defensive in Nina. To talk about a collaboration. Why? He was flirting with you. He was being professional, Nina shot back. And even if he wasn't, why would it matter? Germano's head snapped toward her. Why would it? He stopped, breathing hard. You're my wife. On paper, Nina said, the words bitter. For 4 more days. The silence that followed was deafening. Is that what you think? Germano's voice was dangerously quiet. That this is just paper? I don't know what to think anymore, Nina said, exhaustion and hurt bleeding into her words. We confessed we loved each other, then went right back to pretending. We touch in private and pull away in public. I heard women tonight calling me temporary, saying you'll trade up once the trust is secured. And her voice cracked, I don't know if they're right. They're not, Germano said fiercely. How do I know that? Nina turned to face him fully, tears burning. How do I know this isn't just gratitude? Or convenience? Or some temporary feeling that will disappear once the contract ends and reality sets in? Because I told you I loved you, Germano said, his voice rising. I told you this was real. On a rooftop, in private, where no one could hear, Nina countered. But you haven't told anyone else. Your attorney still thinks we're following the contract. The board members are verifying our marriage like it's a business transaction. Because that's what it is, Germano. That's what it's always been. That's not fair, isn't it? Nina felt something breaking inside her. In 4 days, the contract expires. The trust will be secured. And then what? We just... What? Pretend the last 4 months happened organically? Tell people we're staying married because we fell in love while fulfilling a legal requirement? Yes, Germano said desperately. Yes, exactly that. They'll never believe it, Nina whispered. They already don't. I'm the desperate widow who needed money. You're the billionaire who needed a wife. No one will see anything beyond that. I don't care what they see, Germano said. But I do. The confession tore out of Nina. Because they're not wrong. I am desperate. I did need money. I'm not... She stopped, the words catching in her throat. You're not what? Germano pressed. Good enough for this, Nina finished quietly. For you. For this life. I'm 15 years older, Germano. I have nothing to offer you that hundreds of other women couldn't offer better. Stop, Germano's voice cracked. Stop saying that. It's true. It's not. He turned in his seat, grabbing her hands. Nina, you're everything I never knew I needed. You see me, actually see me, not my money or my company or the legacy I'm supposed to uphold. You make me want to be better. You make this house feel like home. You make me believe I deserve... He stopped, his grip tightening. You make me believe I deserve to be loved. Nina's tears spilled over. I'm so afraid, she whispered. I lost Michael. I lost my career, my home, everything I'd built. And now I'm terrified that in 4 days, I'll lose you too. That this, whatever we have, will disappear when the contract ends and we're left with nothing but a legal document and memories of pretending. We're not pretending, Germano said, his own voice thick with emotion. I'm not pretending. This is the most real thing I've ever felt in my life, and it terrifies me too. Because I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to love someone without ruining it. I watched my father die. I've failed at every relationship I've attempted. And you... He cupped her face, his thumb wiping away her tears. You deserve someone who knows how to do this right. Someone who isn't broken. Someone... Stop, Nina interrupted, seeing her own fears mirrored in his eyes. You're not broken. Neither are you, Germano said fiercely. But we're both so afraid of losing each other that we can't figure out how to actually be together. The truth of it hung between them. Two people in love, terrified by the vulnerability it required, paralyzed by the fear of losing what they'd found. They arrived at the mansion, the car stopping in the circular driveway. Neither moved to get out. What do we do? Nina asked quietly. How do we move forward when we're both this scared? I don't know, Germano admitted. But Nina, I meant what I said on the rooftop. I'm in love with you. Not temporarily, not conveniently, completely. I love you too, Nina whispered. But I don't know if love is enough when we're both too afraid to trust it. Germano flinched like she'd struck him. So what are you saying? I'm saying we need time, Nina said, though it killed her to say it. To figure out what this looks like when the contract isn't dictating our lives, when the deadline isn't looming, when we can actually choose each other without pressure or fear or time, Germano repeated flatly. You want space. I want to believe this is real, Nina said desperately. But right now, I can't separate what we feel from what we're obligated to feel. And I think, she took a shaky breath, I think we both need to figure out who we are without the contract defining us. Germano pulled his hands away, and Nina felt the loss like a physical wound. So that's it? His voice was cold now, walls slamming back into place. We just... What? Finish out the 4 days and then walk away? That's not what I'm saying, isn't it? Germano opened the car door, stepping out into the night. You want time, Nina? Fine. You've got it. Germano, wait! But he was already walking toward the house, his posture rigid, every line of his body radiating hurt and anger. Nina sat in the car, tears streaming down her face, watching him disappear inside. She'd wanted honesty, wanted to voice the fears that had been eating at her since the rooftop, but all she'd done was push away the one person who'd made her feel alive again. Inside, Nina found her suite dark and empty. She changed mechanically, removing the beautiful dress, washing off her makeup, going through motions that felt hollow. She heard Germano moving in his room, the one separated from hers by a single wall. Heard something crash, a muttered curse, then silence. They were both breaking. Both drowning in fear and love, and the impossibility of bridging the gap between what they wanted and what they believed they deserved. Nina lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the fight. I don't know if love is enough. She'd said that, actually said that to him, and watched him shut down, retreat, disappear behind walls she'd thought they'd finally torn down. 4 days left. 4 days to figure out if they could salvage this, or if they'd destroy it before it ever had a chance to become real. Outside her window, storm clouds gathered, and Nina wondered if they'd just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The 4 days after their fight felt like 4 years. Germano became a ghost in his own house. He left for work before Nina woke. He returned late, disappearing into his office without a word, so... When they did cross paths, in the kitchen, in the hallway, he was polite, distant, every wall rebuilt higher than before. Nina told herself this was what she'd asked for. Space, time to figure things out. But it felt like dying. She caught glimpses of him through windows, sitting on the terrace at midnight, shoulders hunched. Heard him pacing in his room at 3 a.m., restless and alone. Saw the exhaustion carved into his face during the one trust meeting they both attended, where they sat at opposite ends of the table and spoke only when directly addressed. Wellington stopped eating properly, moving between their rooms with confused meows, as if asking why his humans had stopped being happy. Rosa watched them with sad eyes but said nothing. Margaret stopped visiting entirely. On the third day, the trust attorney called. The inheritance had been verified, all requirements met. The Germano Philanthropic Trust would officially transfer to Germano at midnight on the contract's expiration date. They'd succeeded. The 4-month marriage had served its purpose. Nina should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt hollow. That evening, she stood in her suite, the room that had stopped feeling temporary weeks ago, and began to pack. She had the $400,000 initial payment. The $1.5 million final payment would transfer tomorrow. She could start over, find a new apartment, maybe return to nonprofit work, build a life that wasn't borrowed, wasn't built on a contract, wasn't breaking her heart with every passing hour. She folded clothes mechanically, placing them in boxes that reminded her painfully of the ones she'd packed before the foreclosure. Coming full circle? Except this time she had money and no idea what to do with it. A photo caught her eye. One Rosa had taken of her and Germano at dinner, both laughing at something Wellington had done. They looked happy, real, like people actually in love. Nina's vision blurred with tears. She'd asked for space because she was terrified of losing him. And in doing so, she'd lost him anyway. The cruelest irony. A knock on her door made her jump. "Nina?" Margaret's voice. "May I come in?" Nina wiped her eyes quickly. "Of course." Margaret entered, taking in the half-packed boxes with an expression that was equal parts disappointed and determined. "You're leaving," she said simply. "The contract expires tomorrow," Nina replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's time." "Is it?" Margaret closed the door, moving to sit on the edge of the bed. "Or are you running because you're afraid?" Nina's throat tightened. "I'm not." "You are. And so is my son." Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. "You're both so terrified of being hurt that you're choosing loneliness over risk, choosing certainty over possibility." She paused. "Choosing fear over love." "He doesn't want this anymore," Nina whispered. "He's been avoiding me for days. He's made it clear." "He's made nothing clear," Margaret interrupted. "Nina, my son has been in love with you since that first night you held him when he couldn't sleep. Maybe before that. He's loved you through every dinner, every board meeting, every moment you made this enormous house feel like a home." Nina's hands trembled. "Then why?" "Because you told him you needed time, that you couldn't separate obligation from feeling, that you didn't know if love was enough." Margaret's eyes were kind but piercing. "You broke his heart, Nina. Not intentionally, but you did. And now he's convinced himself that you're going to leave tomorrow, that everything you shared was just a beautiful impossibility, that he's not worthy of you choosing to stay." "Not worthy?" Nina's voice cracked. "He thinks he's not worthy of me?" My son watched his father die slowly, painfully. He spent years building walls to protect himself from that kind of loss. You made him tear those walls down, made him vulnerable again, made him feel... Margaret's voice softened. "And then you pulled away. So yes, he thinks he's not worthy. He thinks he's too broken, too damaged, too much responsibility for someone who deserves better." Nina pressed her hands to her face, tears spilling through her fingers. I was just scared. I know. Margaret stood, placing a hand on Nina's shoulder. But the question is, are you brave enough to stop being scared? Are you willing to fight for what you want? Because tomorrow, that contract expires. And if you leave without telling him how you really feel, not in fear, but in truth, you'll both spend the rest of your lives wondering what could have been. After Margaret left, Nina stood in her half-packed room for a long time. Then she left the boxes where they were and went to find her husband. Germano's office door was closed, light visible underneath. Nina didn't knock. She opened the door and walked in. He was at his desk, staring at his computer screen without really seeing it. He looked up when she entered, surprise flickering across his exhausted face before his expression shuddered. Nina, did you need something? His voice was carefully neutral. Yes, she said, closing the door behind her. I need to talk to you. It's late. I don't care. Nina moved closer, her heart hammering. We're going to have this conversation, Germano. No more running, no more walls, no more being too afraid to say what we actually mean. Something shifted in his expression, wariness mixing with desperate hope. What do you want me to say? Nothing. I want you to listen. Nina took a shaky breath. I was wrong. That night after the fundraiser, when I said I needed time, when I said I didn't know if love was enough, I was wrong. I was scared and hurt, and I lashed out because I heard those women calling me temporary, and I believed them. I let my fear convince me that what we have couldn't be real, because it started with a contract. Germano stood slowly, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. Nina, I'm not finished. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't stop. I've been packing, getting ready to leave tomorrow when the contract expires, telling myself it's what we both wanted, that we needed distance to figure things out. But the truth is, I've never been more certain of anything in my life than I am of this. She moved closer, closing the space between them. I love you. Not because you saved me from foreclosure. Not because you gave me a home when I had nowhere to go. I love you because you're kind and broken and real. Because you defend me to cruel people. Because you revised a contract to protect me. Because you collapse in my arms when the world gets too heavy and you trust me to hold you. Nina, stop! Germano's voice cracked. You don't have to. I'm not done, Nina said fiercely. I love you because when I'm with you, I'm not the widow drowning in grief or the failure who lost everything. I'm just Nina. And you see that Nina, really see her, in ways no one else does. You make me want to be brave again. You make me believe I deserve. Her voice broke. You make me believe I deserve to be loved. Germano was around the desk in 2 strides, his hands cupping her face, his eyes searching hers desperately. Say it again, he whispered. I love you. Say it again. I love you, Nina said, laughing through her tears. I love you. I love you. He kissed her. Finally. After months of almost kisses and interrupted moments and carefully maintained distance, Germano kissed her like she was oxygen and he'd been drowning. His lips were desperate against hers, his hands trembling as they cradled her face. Nina's arms wrapped around his neck, pulling him closer, pouring months of longing and fear and love into the kiss. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Germano pressed his forehead to hers. 4 months weren't enough, he said roughly. They'll never be enough. I want a lifetime, Nina. I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to argue about trust proposals and dance at galas and hold you when you can't sleep. I want Wellington to be our cat instead of just mine. I want... His voice broke. I want forever. With you. Only you. Yes, Nina whispered. Yes to all of it. The contract expires tomorrow. I don't care about the contract. Nina interrupted. I never want to hear about that contract again. This isn't about legal obligations or inheritance clauses. This is about you and me choosing each other. Really choosing, not because we have to, but because we want to. Germano pulled back just enough to see her face fully, his expression vulnerable in ways she'd never seen before. I was convinced you'd leave tomorrow, that I'd wake up and you'd be gone and I'd have lost the best thing that ever happened to me. I'm not going anywhere, Nina said firmly, unless you're coming with me. We're a package deal now. He laughed, actually laughed, the sound breaking through the tension that had suffocated them for days. A package deal? You, me, and Wellington, Nina confirmed. Non-negotiable. Germano kissed her again, softer this time, tender and full of promise. I love you, he murmured against her lips. I'm completely, impossibly, permanently in love with you. Good, Nina said, smiling through her tears, because I'm not giving you back. They ended up on the floor of his office, backs against the desk, holding each other like they might disappear if they let go. What do we tell people? Germano asked after a while. About us? The truth, Nina said simply. That we got married for practical reasons and fell in love along the way. That sometimes the best things happen when you're not looking for them. They'll still judge. Let them. Nina threaded her fingers through his. I don't care what anyone thinks except you and Wellington. Germano laughed again, the sound growing easier. Wellington's opinion is very important. The most important, Nina agreed. They sat in comfortable silence, fingers intertwined. The weight of fear finally lifted. I want to renew our vows, Germano said suddenly. Not for the trust, not for appearances, just for us. A real ceremony, with real promises, choosing each other without contracts or deadlines. Nina's heart swelled. When? Whenever you're ready. Tomorrow? Next month? Next year? I just want you to know. He turned to face her fully. I want you to know that I'm choosing you, Nina Williams. Every day, for the rest of my life, I'm choosing you. And I'm choosing you, Nina whispered. Christopher Germano. For better or worse, richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, he continued, smiling. For as long as we both shall live, they finished together. It wasn't a legal ceremony. There were no witnesses, no official documents, but it was the most binding vow either of them had ever made. The next morning, Nina woke in Germano's arms, not in her suite or his, but in the master bedroom they'd moved to together at 3 a.m., both too happy to sleep alone anymore. Sunlight filtered through the windows. Wellington purred between them, pleased his humans had finally figured things out. Good morning, wife, Germano murmured sleepily. Good morning, husband, Nina replied, the words feeling right in ways they never had before. The contract had expired at midnight, but their marriage, their real marriage, was just beginning. Later that day, Margaret arrived to find them cooking breakfast together, laughing as Germano tried and failed to flip pancakes, while Nina offered unhelpful commentary. Well, Margaret said, smiling broadly, I see you two figured it out. We did, Nina confirmed, moving into Germano's arms naturally, easily. Finally, Margaret added with exasperation. I was ready to lock you both in a room until you stopped being stubborn. We got there eventually, Germano said, pressing a kiss to Nina's temple. Margaret's eyes shimmered with tears. Your father would have loved her, Christopher. He would have been so happy to see you like this. Germano's grip on Nina tightened. I think he would have too. 6 months later, they renewed their vows on the beach at sunset. Just family and close friends. Nothing like the sterile courthouse ceremony that had started everything. Nina wore white. Germano cried during his vows. Wellington somehow ended up in several of the photos, looking smug. Sherry served as maid of honor, whispering to Nina, "I told you it was real." Margaret cried through the entire ceremony, and when the officiant said, "You may kiss the bride," Germano pulled Nina close and whispered, "4 months became forever, just like it was supposed to." "Just like it was always meant to be," Nina corrected. They kissed as the sun set over the water, surrounded by people who loved them, in a marriage that had started as pretend and become the most real thing either of them had ever known. Later, dancing under string lights with the ocean breeze around them, Nina realized something. She'd agreed to a 4-month vow with a younger billionaire because she was desperate and had nowhere else to turn. But he'd ended up adoring her for life, not because of a contract, not because of obligation, but because sometimes love finds you in the most unexpected places, and sometimes the best things in life start with a simple yes and become something extraordinary.